So before we dive into the episode, I want to mention that Hannah and I are not healthcare professionals. So any information we share is not intended to diagnose, treat, or prevent any illness. We're just sharing our personal experience and what we've learned with both going through Lyme treatment. Okay, welcome back to the Wellness Digest. Today we're going to talk about Lyme disease. We're going to share our POV on Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses. It's a topic that's very close to our hearts because we both have been in treatment for it at different times in our life. And we've learned a lot along the way. And our hope is that sharing what we've learned, along with some tips on how to prevent getting bitten by a tick and contracting this illness to begin with, will help a lot of people out there.
So let's dive into the numbers a little bit. So a 2023 report showed that 89,000 cases of Lyme disease were officially reported to the CDC. However, other sources estimate around 476,000 new cases a year. And I think part of why there's a big difference is because, one, when we say Lyme, we really only refer to one of the pathogens that a tick can give us. And also, some people just don't report it to the CDC, and some goes undiagnosed, as we'll go into later. And then second, according to the Global Lyme Alliance, scientists estimated in 2020 that about 2 million people could suffer from post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome in the next few years, which is a wild number and kind of scary to think about that, while awareness is increasing, I think there's still so much confusion around it, and even different levels of education by doctors and, just in the general public, especially in the summer in these tick-rich areas like along the East Coast. So I'm very excited to dive into this.
Yeah.
Why don't you start with just giving us a quick overview of, what is Lyme? What are the symptoms?
Yeah, I want to add to that too that generally speaking, we can probably both agree that Lyme is underdiagnosed. It's a bit misunderstood, and it's growing in prevalence.
Absolutely.
Lyme disease is a pathogen called Borrelia, and it's largely transmitted by ticks. So as Hannah said, it's very prevalent on the East Coast, but cases are also being reported really throughout the US and on the West Coast. There's two kind of types of Lyme disease. You could have it acutely, which means that you've had a tick bite and contracted this pathogen in the last few weeks, and you're diagnosed for it and you are treated for it, and most of the time you're fine after, right? You have a round of antibiotics or two and you are free and clear. However, the issue really comes in when these pathogens stay within your body and kind of fester and thrive and go dormant versus active for several years, and that type of Lyme disease is called chronic or persistent Lyme disease. So I want to also mention that throughout this podcast, when we say Lyme disease, we're really talking about tick-borne infections, and that includes the Borrelia bacteria that is associated with Lyme disease, but also several other ones, including Babesia, Anaplasma, Mycoplasma, and so
Rocky
on.
Mountains fever, like
Rickettsia, the list goes on. So, for Hannah and I, and we'll get into our kind of personal stories, we had several of these bacteria, and it all contributed to a big storm of imbalance in our bodies. So for acute Lyme, most common symptoms are flu-like symptoms, body aches, fever. For some people, it starts with noticing the tick bite and having a bullseye rash, and then following up with those symptoms. For some people, however, you never even notice the tick bite and you don't have a bullseye rash. So if you're getting this flu-like illness in the summer, most importantly, during the warm months, make sure you get tested for Lyme and tick-borne illness.
Especially if nobody else around you has anything or catches it. That I think back to for me sometimes. It's like I had some of these symptoms and nobody else was sick.
Right.
But I just thought it was a cold, a flu.
Right, because it's not actually contagious.
Yeah,
it's
not. It's from the tick. Your body's immune system is just reacting to the pathogen.
Yeah, and then for persistent or chronic Lyme disease, the symptoms, the list goes on and on. It really manifests differently in a lot of different bodies. However, for you and I, some symptoms we had in common was just generally like a weaker immune system, less resilience to stress, headaches, joint aches, weird kind of, gut issues, or like we both had back issues at the time, and it just kind of, goes in and out depending on like where your body is. And also at some point it becomes so intense that you just can't ignore it anymore, and you kind of try to get to the root cause of what's going on.
That's also why they call it the great imitator, because the symptoms of this persistent, lingering, or chronic Lyme, they are so broad that, many people get misdiagnosed for like rheumatoid arthritis, IBS, like weird things. Whereas often then if you look, there's this underlying unresolved tick-borne illness. So now how do you test for it? This is another one where I think there's a lot of confusion. So if you have a tick bite and you notice it, or if you have this bullseye rash, or even if you get these flu-like symptoms in the summer and you get a tick bite, they usually do kind of the faster tick bites called the ELISA test. And then there's, I think, the Western blot test. So there's a couple of tests that you do that essentially detect if you have active antibodies against this. So that's for the acute infection. However, once this turns persistent or chronic, those tests can show up as negative. So basically they say you don't have it, but you do have it. And for that kind of persistent, more chronic Lyme, that's when you actually need to do more complicated antibody tests, or even you can look at blood under a microscope and see these, or even genetic tests to see like genetic material in the blood. So that's where it gets a little bit more advanced and complicated. And I think that's also why so many people get misdiagnosed, because, the quick tests show up as negative.
Right. You really need to find a tick literate doctor, or a
Yes.
Lyme literate doctor to test.
And by the way, there's great resources for this too. The Global Lyme Alliance, for example, they actually have a directory of Lyme literate doctors around the country that they're continuing to build out. So if you feel like, ooh, I think I might have something like this, that's a really good place to start. So should we dive into the stories?
Yeah, let's quickly hear your Lyme journey,
Sure.
and I'll follow it up with mine.
Sure. So, to keep it short, I'm pretty sure I contracted this tick bite when I was in my summer between junior and senior year in college. We were on Nantucket. I remember finding the tiniest tick on my leg. But as I was taught, I put a little circle around it with a Sharpie and was watching it. I obviously took the tick out, but put the circle around the tick bite and was watching to see if the bullseye rash came. No bullseye rash, so I assumed I was fine. 2 weeks later, I'm back in college. I'm the only person who gets the flu. High fever, chills, body aches. No one else around me was sick. Later that year, I started getting headaches that I'd never had before. I started getting back pain that nobody could explain. But nothing was bad enough that people were like, oh, I think you need to go see another specialist. It was just like, oh, you're in college, you're probably working too much and like exercising, sitting badly, whatever. And then it really only started getting to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore when I was working after college in my first job in management consulting. I was traveling a lot. I wasn't sleeping as much as I should have been, probably taxing my immune system. And that's really when I started noticing things like feeling so fatigued after my workouts, even though they weren't super intense. Walking up the stairs started hurting. My brain started getting slower, and I felt like I was the slowest person on my team, which had never happened to me before. And then kind of as it progressed and I kept ignoring it, I started getting gut issues. I was the one who always got food poisonings, like mild food poisonings after eating out with my friends, but nobody else got it. And then eventually got to the point where like my muscles were like spasming and I was almost like shaking uncontrollably. And that really led to a day when I just could not get out of bed. And thankfully, my aunt, actually, our aunt in Germany, she had seen me a couple of weeks before that, and she had said, Hannah, I think you need to get tested for Lyme and tick-borne illnesses. So I followed her advice and was so lucky to pretty quickly find a functional medicine doctor in New York City who was really trained and specializing in helping people with tick-borne illnesses. And that really was the beginning of my healing journey.
No, I mean, our journeys, like now looking back, I think it's so crazy that even though I watched you go through all of this, like I basically ignored the fact that I had a bullseye rash like several years after just having spent time in Connecticut. And then I got sick and had the flu and like, things deteriorated kind of a few years after that or like a year after that. And I did not make the connection.
But neither did I,
Yeah.
which is crazy. I mean, you thought,
It was a spider bite.
you sent me pictures of this huge thing on your leg and you were like, I got bit by a spider. And I thought it was just a bad reaction to a mosquito bite, which is crazy. But it just goes to show that even a few years ago, it just wasn't something that was top of mind, despite the fact that it was summer on the East Coast. It's crazy.
Similarly to you, I guess I had a tick bite. I had a bullseye rash. Didn't put the two and two together. I got a flu a few weeks after that, and then only kind of a year later, I started having one thing after the other. Back issues, gut issues, skin issues, and just thought, I'm burnt out. I'm in a high intensity work environment in LA, but it got to a point, actually even another year after that, after dealing with these things, actually more than a year after that, like several years after that, where I just could not ignore it anymore.
Right.
And I lost like a lot of weight. I had nutrient deficiencies. I was just so unhappy with like having reactions to different foods.
You
and,
reacted to everything.
And, had so many like joint and headaches and was so tired all the time. And, I had just gotten married. I was like in such a wonderful place in my life. I was starting to think about having kids, but I definitely knew I had to get my health in check.
Yeah.
And then finally I did get tested and I had several of these like tick-borne illnesses.
Yeah, so crazy. So looking back on that, as you said, our journeys were in some ways so similar. And by the way, this is not just our journeys being similar. I mean, we have talked to so many people. Once you go through this, suddenly you meet people everywhere who either themselves went through it or had a family member. And there are so many similarities between everyone's journeys. So it's usually, it's these like, it builds up over a few years to the point where you can't ignore it. It's all these different like diffuse symptoms. And then it takes a long time to really heal.
Yeah, a few reflections. I mean, I think we both felt the immensity of these pathogens taking hold in our body and how it truly like broke down our system over several years to a point where we could not ignore it anymore. We could not go on like this. Once you are diagnosed, the recovery takes several months, sometimes even years. I think I was in a lucky position because the research and our knowledge of Lyme disease had increased so much over the last, I guess, 10 years that I immediately kind of had a good plan forward. And I actually will get into this more too. I did not end up taking the antibiotic route. I actually ended up taking a more like alternative natural approach to clearing the infection with antimicrobial herbs and ozone therapy. And I think that allowed me to recover quicker than you did.
For sure. And I think also, I kind of feel like once you were deteriorating, you were kind of like, wait, something is wrong. Whereas I feel like, although maybe this is just lived experience, but I feel like for me, I was for way too long attributing it to like, I'm burnt out or whatever, So I wonder if that also just helped you get through it faster.
I think so. I mean, I was a bit older. I was approaching my 30s, and I think I was maybe more in tune with my body. And having seen you go through this healing journey, I knew that it was time for me to take this seriously. Another thing is that while you can clear these pathogens, at least most people, your body most likely will be changed after, some ways in a positive way, because I think we're more in tune with ourselves. We're definitely living a more like holistic and wellness-rich life, but we both have some food allergies. We both probably are more sensitive to our environment and different products. So that is something to just, keep in mind and be okay with. And then ultimately, these challenging times were actually quite transformative. As I said, good and bad can come from this kind of health journey.
Absolutely. I mean, I know you'll get into this too, but for me, I truly think, I mean, first of all, it really immersed me into this functional medicine and holistic health world, which I'm so thankful for. Just seeing how that has made my whole life and my health and well-being so into such a better thing. And I mean, now also giving that to my family, you know, has been so transformative, but also on a professional path. I mean, you know, I was pretty sad when I was coming out of college that I thought I wanted to be like a Fortune 500 CEO, probably in some manufacturing company or something. And I think this really made me reflect and say, no, I want to be working in the health and wellness space. And, you know, that's how we also found Omnibiotic and essentially what led us to where we are today. So there's always a silver lining.
Yeah, good thing.
So let's talk a little bit about what we wish people knew about Lyme and tick-borne illnesses. So there's a couple of things. Number one, even though it's not a genetic condition, oftentimes it can impact multiple family members, as it did with us and as it does in many other situations, because you vacation in the same tick-rich environments, you live on the East Coast, you know, it's just you're kind of sharing the exposure environment. Number two, diagnosis. So as Lena mentioned earlier, some people get the bullseye rash, but only about 30% of people develop this bullseye rash. So it's not actually a reliable diagnosis. Many doctors only test for Lyme versus all the other co-infections. So even though you might come up negative on Lyme, you might have some of these other co-infections that can equally make you very sick and be quite persistent. And then, as we briefly touched on earlier, there's different standards of testing for the acute versus the chronic version. So really making sure, especially if you suspect something is going undiagnosed, to find a Lyme literate doctor who can help you do the right tests.
Another really important point about Lyme disease is that early detection makes all the difference. If you notice you have a tick bite, you have the bullseye rash, or you don't, you develop flu-like symptoms, even just developing flu-like symptoms, not even knowing if you've had a tick bite, make sure you get tested for Lyme and co-infections, because you can take a round of antibiotics. It's actually a pretty quick and easy treatment, and you're good.
Right.
The issue really comes in when these bacteria are just thriving in your body, becoming active and then dormant again based on like where you are in life, how stressed you are, and how strong your body is. And then the treatment becomes a lot more severe, and it becomes a longer journey for you to get better.
And your body, I think, just gets into such a depleted state. You know, as you said, like your immune system is a mess, you're nutrient depleted, your gut is inflamed. There's just so much more beyond even the Lyme to repair from. By the way, one other thing on the early detection that I want to mention is, for example, for me, if I were to find a tick on me or on my daughter, I would take that tick off, put it in a plastic bag, and actually send it to these tick check labs. So if you just Google like tick check lab near me, for us here in Connecticut, I think there's one in Pennsylvania. So they give you instructions of how to do that, and you can order various panels so they examine the tick for these pathogens. So that's a way where you can then at least say, okay, was this tick even infected? And if it was, then I would absolutely make sure to run all my tests. And, you know, then it really depends on what the doctor recommends of potentially even doing a preventative course of antibiotics just to play it safe. So,
and then a key part of the healing journey for Lyme is actually addressing underlying other conditions as well. So as Hannah said, the body can become really off balance because these pathogens have been, you know, wreaking havoc in your body for years. So oftentimes that leaves room for other things to thrive, for you to become more sensitive and pick up things along the way. So a key part of actually clearing the body of these infections is also then checking for underlying conditions like mold, heavy metals, Epstein-Barr virus,
thyroid,
the list, you know, even, you know, gut imbalances, the list goes on. And all these symptoms will probably contribute to you feeling really unwell, and clearing the infection is just one part of the equation or the journey to feeling your very best again.
I think for me, it was like at least the same amount of time to clear the Lyme as it then took me to recover from those many months of antibiotics and to just fix all these other imbalances and like replenish my nutrients and reduce my inflammation. So you and I were both talking about it. That's the really demoralizing part because, in many other cases, if you are done with your, flu treatment or, you're done with bronchitis, you generally after a few weeks feel perfectly fine again. But with this, that long road to then addressing all these other things, that can be kind of a mind game.
Okay, so let's shift gears and really focus on treatment.
Yeah.
What are the steps?
Right. So the first step with any pathogen is to clear it out of your system. The more traditional approach with tick-borne pathogens has been kind of a cocktail of antibiotics. It depends on the specific pathogen and on the doctor, but usually it's at least 2 or 3 antibiotics, sometimes even IV antibiotics over a long course, so usually at least 6 months. And then you do repeat testing to see if anything is left over. However, as Lena mentioned, as you mentioned earlier, there are some newer protocols now that are actually so exciting because they're mainly rooted in herbs and herbal antimicrobials that are so effective too. And then you add on things like ozone therapy, acupuncture, things like that to just really strengthen your body. But yeah, I'm excited about those because, at least you're reducing some of the impact of the real antibiotics. And then, in addition to getting those pathogens out, the other thing that you touched on earlier is also addressing these other triggers. So is it Epstein-Barr? Is it a low thyroid? Is it, low underperforming adrenals? Just to make sure that in this phase, you're also kind of boosting your body and lifting it up so it can have the healing powers to really fully recover.
And then phase 2 is all about rebuilding. So as we can talk about from personal experience, after these months of clearing out the pathogen, your body is quite depleted. My immune system was in overdrive. I was just reacting to everything, foods, the sun, a bug bite, just everything was leading to intense inflammation and big reactions. You need to rebuild the gut, especially after these antibiotic or antimicrobial treatments. They're killing the bad stuff, but also the good stuff. We've talked about this a lot before. So you're really needing to replenish these good gut bacteria, reduce inflammation in the gut, rebuild your gut barrier, and also really just strengthening your detox pathways. Your body has done a lot of work detoxing. Your liver might be overwhelmed. Your lymph system might be overwhelmed. So, for me personally, it was a lot about rest. I also really enjoyed cold exposure therapy. I also learned from working with a Lyme literate doctor that my body needed a little bit of help digesting histamine. So I had a bit of a histamine intolerance. So she just gave me some supplements to help with that, and that, helped balance my immune reactions and also reduce inflammation in the body. And acupuncture.
Yes, big fan of acupuncture for everything. I mean, it supports your immune system. It helps your detox pathways. It can help just with like reducing anxiety and improving mental clarity. So a huge, huge component for both of our healing journeys, I would say.
I love how you talked a little bit also about like the mental aspect, because I feel like that's a big part too. Like for me, it was also about learning to have faith in my body again and trusting that my body is healthy and kind of like rewiring my brain to understand that and to act accordingly. And then also really finding joy. Joy is a huge healer.
Absolutely. So with all this talk about antibiotics and antimicrobials and even the pathogens themselves wreaking havoc on our gut, we would be remiss to not talk about the gut connection in all of this. And, we've said it before, we will say it again, antibiotics do not discriminate between the good and the bad bacteria in our gut. So even a very short course of antibiotics can have a lasting impact on reducing the diversity and quantity of bacteria in our gut. So even if you're the person who had the bullseye, got your 5 days of doxycycline, and you think you're fine, please make sure your gut is being replenished so that you don't run into issues in the future. The other thing that we noticed, and practitioners talk about this too all the time, is the Lyme pathogens can cause inflammation and really wreak havoc on our gut themselves. If you then layer on the antibiotics for months and months, or the herbal antimicrobials for months and months, that further diminishes the bacteria and can even cause dysbiosis, extra inflammation, just kind of piling on the issues. So it's important to keep your gut in mind and to really replenish the gut, both during the active Lyme treatment and then also in the months and potentially even years following, so that you make sure you get back to a good baseline. Within the omnibiotic ecosystem, omnibiotic AB10 is our go-to for anyone who needs to restore and replenish their gut. This product was specifically developed with 10 very important strains for the gut microbiome to replenish and restore. It has shown in clinical studies to reduce the incidence of antibiotic-associated diarrhea, and it even contains some strains that can actively fight certain pathogenic bacteria that can otherwise cause issues in our gut. So that is a big part, especially in the kind of active treatment phase of Lyme, while you're taking these antibiotics and antimicrobials. However, what after that can also be very helpful is omnibiotic stress release, because that product was specifically also designed to reduce inflammation in the intestine. And so many people we talk to, and also practitioners, they see leaky gut as a big kind of cofactor in these tick-borne illnesses, because you have all this inflammation. So omnibiotic stress release really to support the reduction of that inflammation, to strengthen the gut barrier. And frankly, at least for me, I don't know how it was with you, but for me, it tremendously helped with my brain fog and my energy levels and my sleep, and also to just make me feel a little bit more calm and resilient.
Okay, so now that we've talked all about what happens if you contract Lyme, let's take it a step back and talk about how to actually prevent getting a tick bite and contracting any of these pathogens. So generally speaking, ticks are in high grassy areas, mostly on the East Coast, but as we've said, they're also now starting to pop up in different areas throughout the US. They love to be on deer and bunnies and rodents and mice. So in those areas where there is a high deer population, like Nantucket, where we just spent some time on vacation, ticks are even more prevalent. So in terms of prevention, what we do is we're spraying our lawns with tick deterrent. We're usually a very crunchy, clean household and family, but with ticks, we don't play around. Right. So especially before we go to Nantucket, we're making sure that the lawn has been treated for ticks.
Now, I do want to say, though, that's because literally Nantucket has a big problem with ticks, right? Like if this was just a random house with like a small yard in a sort of somewhat suburban environment where you don't often find ticks, you probably don't need to be that intense. Depends. So, we kind of leave that up to you. But it's really a balance between, as you said, being crunchy and being conscious of the environment, but also understanding that if we go outside, we want our kids and our pets and ourselves to be safe. So
yeah. Another tip is with your pets, if you have dogs or cats, we highly recommend giving them tick preventative medicine. So our dogs are both on tick preventative medicine, and during the summer, we often kind of make a rule that they're not allowed in beds or on furniture. And if they are on your bed, maybe just having like a really clean white sheet so you can check it before you get into bed for ticks. And then daily tick checks. So we've gotten in the habit of doing this ourselves before bed, just checking the body for ticks. And now with little ones, we also do it for the babies and the toddlers. And hopefully this goes without saying, but I'll just mention it again. If you are feeling unwell with flu-like symptoms in the summer months, get checked for ticks and co-infections.
So one of the things we haven't touched on is kind of the mental load and the mental aspect of something like a tick-borne illness. And this is not just me and you. This is pretty much everybody who has gone through a more persistent case of Lyme or tick-borne illness. It's a kind of an invisible disease. And, for me and for you, there were so many moments when we looked fine. In fact, I think in many pictures, we looked pretty great because we're like trying to rest and eat well and,
skinny because
because you are reacting to everything. So on the surface, you look well, but inside you feel absolutely miserable. And just the isolation that can cause. I mean, the amount of times, even when I was sharing how I'm feeling with even close family or friends, they often just looked at me and they were like, but you look fine. And that's just like such a discouraging.
Yeah.
It comes from a good place. They want to be kind and supportive, but they also don't know because they've never been through it. So this "but you look fine" has been kind of a triggering sentence for me, and I think for you too.
Yeah.
But yeah, many people, you go through this and it feels isolating. And I think the other part of that, which I know you really struggled with too, is you have to say no to so many things. I mean, the amount of friend gatherings, events, fun things, weddings, birthday parties that Lena and I both said no to while we were going through this recovery. And it's just so hard every time. And sometimes, especially because the healing is also not linear, you commit because you have a week or two where you're feeling pretty good. You commit to something and then you have to cancel day of because suddenly you're having like a huge reaction to something again. And that's really hard.
Yeah, so I think you really learn who your like true friends and supporting people
Yeah.
are. And yeah, it can be really isolating, and that's a big part of the journey as well.
Yeah, so just to round out the episode, just offering a little bit of hope and positivity at the end of this. I think there's actually, if I just think back about the last 10 years when I, had my tick infections, there has been such a positive and reassuring shift. There's more awareness, more public discussions and disclosure. There's amazing organizations like the Global Lyme Alliance that are really moving the needle on research and education. There is more Lyme literate doctors, especially also in the functional medicine, holistic health space, that are really knowledgeable about these different ways of treatment. And there's been more research. And, so that's kind of just on the landscape itself. And I think looking back on our journeys and again, kind of summarizing what we touched on, I think for me and you and many people we've spoken to, it does build personal resilience. And many people say, that was, of course, a really tough time in their lives, but it also was filled with so many lessons. And, you come out stronger, more vigilant, more mindful, and even healthier, So, just a little word of encouragement there. And then to our listeners, I think, Lena and I really want to leave you with trust your instincts. If you feel something is off, don't wait until it gets so bad that you can't ignore it. Advocate for yourselves and your families, and don't ignore the symptoms, especially in the summer, especially in very tick-rich areas.
Yeah, I would say become your own health advocate, but also become your own researcher. Like, I know for me, I worked with a wonderful doctor in New York City who's very Lyme literate, but I was reading the books. Yolanda Hadid has written a great book on her Lyme journey. Then Ali Hilfiger has written a great book. Like, I was reading the books. I was on Global Lyme Alliance. I was on different websites and just thinking about how else can I approach my treatment and just, get through this pretty quickly and as unfazed as possible. And I would always come to her with ideas, and, she would give me her thoughts and ultimately make them happen or not.
And, also to build on that, not being afraid to get a second opinion. I mean, it's so easy to be like, no, but this is my doctor. I've already spent so much on treatment, because treatment is also still, unfortunately, extremely expensive. But just not being afraid to get a second opinion. And, as you said, also reading and researching about things and observing your body. For me, oftentimes, we uncovered like the next quote issue, or like, my thyroid, my adrenals, etc., because I was keeping close track of my symptoms. Same with you, like the histamine intolerance only came up because you were tracking what foods you were reacting to, and that kind of allowed them to have a fuller picture.
Yeah. Okay, so key takeaways from today. Proper testing makes all the difference with early detection and getting treatment early on in the illness. You do not want these bacteria to just fester and thrive in your body. Prevention, obviously, being vigilant and like trying not to get a tick bite is even better than early detection and early treatment. And then healing requires both really clearing the pathogens and then rebuilding your body, with the gut playing a huge role in this. I mean, the gut, 70% of your immune system or more are housed in the gut. The gut and the liver are connected with your detox pathways.
If you have leaky gut, it totally throws off your immune system. That's
Right, it's a
huge one.
vicious cycle
Yeah.
of just fueling that inflammation throughout your body. Your gut and your brain are connected. You know, the mental aspect of this illness we haven't even touched on, but it's huge, right? And then, lead us to the tip.
Yeah, so I think for me, the tip that I really want to leave you guys with today is if you find a tick on your body, take it off, put it in a little Ziploc bag, and Google where you can get that tick tested. I've done this a few times for ticks that I found on my dog, and it was just so reassuring to know, thankfully, in those cases, the ticks came back negative. It's just so reassuring to know what your next step of action should be. And it also allows you to advocate better for yourself, because if that tick comes back with pathogens, you have that as a piece of evidence to really push for more testing on yourself. And yeah, so with that, we'll round out the episode. Thank you so much for listening and watching. And we invite you to share your own Lyme or tick-borne illness stories with us in the Omnibiotic community. And let us know if you like these slightly more personal takes and episodes, and we'll go from there.